On the 9th of December 1945, a Cadillac staff car crawled through the wreckage of a bombed-out German town, carrying a general who had just won a war he never wanted to stop fighting. Within the hour, a garbage truck would collide with that car, snap his neck, and leave the most feared soldier in the American Army paralyzed in a hospital bed, waiting 12 days to die. He had walked through Sicily under sniper fire, led tanks through the Ardennes in a blizzard, and slapped a shell-shocked soldier so hard the story nearly ended his career. And in the end, it was not a bullet or a bomb that killed George S. Patton. It was a truck on a quiet road in a war that was already over. That irony is where his story really begins, because nothing about George Patton ever ended the way anyone expected, including Patton himself. He was born in 1885 into a family that worshipped military glory the way other families worshipped God. His grandfather had died a Confederate colonel. His great-uncle had died beside him on the same battlefield. The house Patton grew up in was lined with swords, portraits of ancestors in uniform, and stories told at the dinner table about honor and sacrifice until young George could recite them better than his own homework. And that was the problem. He could barely read. Modern historians now believe he was dyslexic, in an era when no one had a word for it, and so the boy who was destined by blood to be a great soldier spent his childhood being called slow. He memorized entire poems and speeches by having his sister read them aloud, because he could hold in his memory what he could not hold on a page. By the time he reached West Point, he had turned that private struggle into something almost frightening, a discipline so total that classmates thought he had been born without doubt. He hadn't. He had simply decided doubt was for other people. He entered World War I a cavalry officer and left it a prophet of a different kind of war, one that had barely been invented yet. In 1917 he was handed command of the Army's 1st Tank Brigade, machines so new that nobody quite trusted them, least of all the generals who still believed in horses. Patton didn't just trust them, he fell in love with them. He personally test-drove early tanks until his uniform was soaked in gasoline, wrote the Army's first training manual for armored warfare, and led his tanks into battle at Saint-Mihiel, walking upright in the open, in full view of German machine guns, because he believed a commander who hid was a commander who would be obeyed out of fear rather than respect. He was shot in the leg during that battle and kept giving orders from a shell hole until he passed out from blood loss. That was not recklessness for its own sake. That was Patton discovering, at 33 years old, exactly what he was for. Then came 20 years of almost nothing. The interwar army shrank to a skeleton, tanks were mothballed, and the man who had once commanded an armored brigade found himself commanding a desk. He wrote papers nobody read about warfare nobody believed was coming. He bred horses and played polo, and some fellow officers quietly considered him a relic, a cavalryman play-acting at being modern. It would have broken most men's careers. Patton simply waited, the way a blade waits in a drawer, and kept sharpening himself for a war that his country insisted was never going to happen again. It happened again in 1939, and Patton was ready before the United States was. When American troops finally landed in North Africa in 1942, the two corps had just suffered a humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass, chewed up by Rommel's Afrika Korps while wearing the wrong uniforms in the wrong terrain with the wrong discipline. Eisenhower needed someone to walk into that broken command and rebuild it in weeks, not months. He sent Patton. Patton arrived, fined soldiers on the spot for not wearing helmets, ordered leggings and neckties in the desert heat, and within days had transformed a demoralized corps into a unit that fought like it again believed it could win. He did not do this by being liked. He did this by being feared into competence, and then, slowly, respected for it. Sicily made him a household name, and very nearly ended him. His 7th Army raced General Montgomery's British forces across the island in a campaign that was as much about wounded pride as it was about strategy. Patton hated, with an almost religious intensity, the idea of an American general finishing second to a British one. He won that race. And then, visiting a field hospital, he encountered 2 soldiers suffering from what was then called battle fatigue, men with no visible wounds, and Patton, convinced that cowardice was a moral failing he could beat out of a man, slapped one of them across the face and called him a coward in front of the entire ward. When the story reached Eisenhower and then the American press, it became a scandal large enough to strip Patton of his command. For nearly a year, the man who had liberated Palermo spent the run-up to D-Day sidelined, humiliated, reduced by his own superiors to a decoy, the fictional commander of a fake army group designed to trick the Germans into believing the invasion would land somewhere it wouldn't. It worked. The Germans feared Patton so much that they kept entire divisions waiting for an invasion that was never coming, purely because his name was attached to it. He became, for a few surreal months, more valuable as a rumor than most generals were as a reality. When he finally got his Third Army back into the war after D-Day, he unleashed something that still startles military historians. In August 1944, Patton's forces broke out of Normandy and simply refused to stop, covering more ground faster than any mechanized army in history had managed before, slicing across France so quickly that his own fuel supply couldn't keep pace with his advance. He argued, begged, and schemed for every gallon of gasoline he could get his hands on, treating logistics the way other generals treated enemy fire, as an obstacle to be defeated through sheer will. Then came the winter of 1944, and the German offensive that shattered American lines in the Ardennes. While other commanders debated how to respond to what would become the Battle of the Bulge, Patton did something almost no army in history had done. He turned an entire army 90 degrees in the dead of winter and marched it more than 100 miles to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne in a matter of days. Before he did it, at a meeting with Eisenhower where every other general hedged and calculated, Patton asked for a chaplain to write him a prayer for good weather, because low cloud cover was grounding the Allied planes his men needed. The prayer got printed and distributed to 250,000 soldiers. Days later, the skies cleared. Patton, ever the showman, later half-joked that he ought to court-martial the chaplain for taking so long to answer a general's prayers, but the men who served under him weren't entirely sure he was joking, because Patton genuinely believed, without apparent contradiction, that he had lived and died and fought in uniform across a dozen previous lives, going back to ancient Rome and beyond. A man who believed himself literally reincarnated for the purpose of war was now leading the single fastest winter counteroffensive of the entire conflict, and it worked. By the time Germany surrendered, Patton commanded more territory, had advanced further, and had inflicted more casualties per day than any other American general of the war. And then peace did to him what combat never managed. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria and found himself, for the first time in his career, completely out of his element, asked to administer a civilian population and navigate denazification policy instead of maneuvering armor across open ground. He made public comments comparing Nazi Party membership to ordinary American political affiliation, arguing that removing every former party member from public administration would cripple Bavaria's ability to function. The comments were true in a narrow bureaucratic sense and disastrous in every other sense, and Eisenhower relieved him of his command in Germany within weeks. The war Patton had been born to fight was over, and the peace that followed had no use for him at all. Which brings the story back to that road outside Mannheim and the garbage truck, and 12 days in a hospital bed where a man who had survived machine gun fire, artillery barrages, and a bullet through the leg finally succumbed to a paralysis that left him unable to feel anything below his neck. He reportedly told his wife, near the end, that it seemed a hell of a way for a soldier to die, not in the glory he had spent his entire life chasing, but slowly, quietly, in a hospital bed, robbed even of the one thing he wanted more than victory itself, which was a soldier's death. What Patton left behind resists a tidy verdict, and maybe that's the most honest thing that can be said about him. He was a brilliant, instinctive commander of armored warfare whose doctrine of speed and aggression is still studied at military academies. He was also a man capable of striking a traumatized soldier and calling it discipline, of making political statements he barely understood the weight of craving glory with an appetite that occasionally outran his judgment. He inspired a devotion in his soldiers that bordered on the fanatical, and inspired a distrust in his superiors that nearly ended his career more than once. He believed himself the reincarnation of ancient warriors, and turned that belief, whatever its truth, into an unshakable confidence that moved armies. Ambition built him, and ambition nearly destroyed him, more than once, and in the end it was neither the enemy nor his own recklessness that killed him, but an accident on a road in a war he had already won. There have been more disciplined generals in American history and more diplomatic ones. There has rarely been one who understood, quite so completely, that war rewards the commander willing to move faster than fear.